Hi, my name is Andrew. Thanks for coming and checking out my Adverse Childhood Experiences presentation, also known as ACE. A little background information. Adverse childhood experiences is the term that's used to describe all types of abuse, neglect, and potentially traumatic experiences that occur to people under the age of 18. From this list, you can see that it encompasses different types of abuse, neglect, forms of domestic violence, as well as a mental health component, and divorce or separation that might occur within a family. The original landmark study done in 1998 first looked at the relationship between adult health risk behaviors and its correlation to childhood abuse and household dysfunction. They were looking at risk factors such as smoking and severe obesity, and also chronic conditions such as heart disease and cancer, and saying, hey, is there a correlation between a person's childhood history of abuse and household dysfunction and a propensity to have an increased risk factor or disease conditions? What the study found out by looking at ACEs specifically was that 1/3 of the population had no ACEs, but almost 2/3 of the population have one or more ACE. Another thing that was interesting was that 50% of women were more likely to have experienced 5 or more ACE categories. And they, through the research, also found out that yes, increased childhood adversities do play a role in a person's health risk and disease conditions. This was from a isolated population in its own sense, that it was a significantly white, educated, middle-class population from Southern California. And what they noticed with the data, as you can see here, 50% of that sample population was white, but when looking at race for blacks and Hispanics, as ACEs increased, they significantly started to outweigh whites in this sample size. Now, they didn't necessarily just address social determinants of health, but they started to look a little bit at race in the data, but it wasn't a point that they really started to investigate. And it took 20 years or more for this other group of researchers to finally start to look at social determinants of health, especially race, when looking at health outcomes. So I pulled a few of these quotes off of their paper here just to show a little bit more of an account of the social determinants of health, which are black children are roughly 3 times more likely to be poor, and Latin people are more likely to be impoverished with similar poverty rates as blacks. Compared to white families, black families are more likely to face social isolation and resource deprivation, and black men are more likely to be incarcerated over their lifetime. With some of the data they found in their research, and they also added 2 additional categories, which was to be treated or judged unfairly because of race and ethnicity, and also victim or witnessing neighborhood violence. They felt like these would help define the population that they were studying a little bit more. And what they noticed was that disadvantage is not spread out equally across all groups. And as shown here, in the data, that the total number of ACEs were significantly associated with the child's race and ethnicity. A majority of white children experienced no ACE exposure at all, almost 60%. And black children were more likely to experience all types of ACEs, and white children had lower exposure to each individual ACE, except in 2 categories where blacks and whites actually swapped as far as their significance. And kind of what the 2 studies, when comparing them side to side a little bit, showed was that among children who were already identified to be higher risk, white children appeared to have similar or even higher levels of ACEs. But among the general population in the current study, white children are less likely to experience ACEs. One thing that I thought was kind of shocking was within this sample of children, a similar percentage of Black children at age 1, 45%, had experienced one ACE compared to white children at age 10. And I felt like this really started to show racial and social disparities among the US population. One other paper I want to point out real quickly from 2016, these researchers compared children of US-born parents versus children of immigrant parents, and they wanted to look at exposure to ACE as well as the role of socioeconomics and health status. Again, it was similar information as the previous study I mentioned, in that Blacks and Hispanic children were exposed to more adversities compared to white children. And children of immigrant parents had overall lower adverse exposure relative to children of US-born parents. And I thought that this was a very interesting statistic, and I think it would be interesting to research that now, especially since immigration is such a hot button topic currently within our political system, if that has changed at all. Also, what I thought was very interesting was that with socioeconomics, income disparities in exposure were larger than racial and ethnic disparities, with low-income white children appearing to be the most disadvantaged group. So this really starts to show the socioeconomic impact that can have on a person's health. So looking at the risk factors again, so exposure for ACEs, race and ethnicity, and socioeconomic status all can contribute to poor health outcomes. So there's been lots of epidemiological studies that have shown that exposure to ACEs negatively impact a person's mental and physical health outcomes. There's been lots of work out there. Just do a couple Google searches and you'll find about everything that you need to know. But what it does go to show is that that ACEs do increase the burden of care for families and for the healthcare system. It can decrease life expectancy with people with 6 or more ACEs. They die nearly 20 years earlier on average than those without ACEs, and 67% of the population has 1 or more ACE. The overall economic costs that you can see from here, the lifetime cost associated with child maltreatment is $1.2 billion. And you can see how that's broken out there in the graph. Robert Black, the former president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, at one time called this ACE is the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. Even though we're recognizing ACEs a lot more as a significant public health issue, we still have a long ways to go so we can have universal interventions to support all children and families. So what can be done? What can be done? Us as healthcare providers, first off, we need to be educated. And it was shown in a study that at a survey out of 110 healthcare providers, only 29% were routinely asking about patterns of history of abuse and maltreatment. As healthcare providers, we're the first line of defense when it comes to maybe intervening for some of the ACEs, and also having an idea of where we can send people for resources. It would help to have universal ACE screening for all healthcare patients and making it part of treatment. If we can start to deal with ACEs, we can also start to better understand the course of disease and also the choices that people are making as far as health risks. Having a standardized tool as a conversational piece to be able to bridge the gap of communication between patients and practitioners might also be helpful for those that are having a difficult time talking about ACEs to their patients. Also getting it incorporated into electronic medical records so that other healthcare providers are aware if there is a family or a person who has been exposed to ACEs. As I mentioned earlier, as healthcare providers, becoming more educated will help us provide better care for our patients. And potentially integrating education for new parents regarding ACEs will really hopefully help curb traumatic experiences for some children. It's part of changing the parent culture. There's a big movement called the No Hit Zone right now, which is trying to change the culture of neglect and violence within homes. And it is about educating new parents. So improving cross-cultural, racial and socioeconomic support for families is needed as well, as ACEs are such a big problem that could almost be seen as systemic. And in my thoughts, ACEs are a social determinant of health as well, as it's been shown to affect people's health outcomes. There's a ton of research. I really appreciate you guys sitting through a little longer presentation. I would recommend that any of you who are interested in further ACE knowledge, go ahead and look at the reference, you know what I'm saying, this page. Find anything that's helpful, go ahead and hit me up if you have any other questions. I can point you to some directions. Thanks for taking the time to watch this.